The land was not just dirt. It was not just acres of grass and trees standing against the slow creep of suburban sprawl. To Henry Carter, it was sacred ground, a living piece of history carved out by his family's resilience. For nearly a century, the Carters had held onto this property with a grip so tight that even the strongest waves of developers had failed to pry it loose. To most people driving past, the land looked empty, forgotten, perhaps even wasted. The fences leaned sideways, vines draped over weathered wood, and patches of wild grass swayed where once gardens and small crops had grown. Children riding bikes through the new neighborhoods called it the jungle. Realtors referred to it as ripe potential. The HOA labeled it an eyesore. But for Henry, every crooked fence post and every towering oak tree carried weight. His grandfather, a black man who had clawed his way out of tenant farming during the hardest decades of the South, had bought the land when very few people who looked like him were allowed to. He had endured years of harassment, threats, and attempted scams. And through all that, he had passed the land to his children with one commandment: never let it go. Henry's father had strengthened the deed, embedding protective covenants into the legal framework of the property. He knew how easily land could be stolen from black families, through fraud, through trickery, through courts that rarely sided with them. So he worked with a lawyer friend who believed in justice, and together they designed something ironclad, a clause that made the land immovable without direct, notarized consent from a Carter heir. It was a fortress of words invisible to most but stronger than steel. Henry knew all this because his father made sure he understood. As a boy, Henry had walked the fields at sunset with him, listening to the stories of struggle and victory. As a teenager, he had watched developers circle like vultures, offering money, bringing contracts, making promises. And as a man, he had carried the burden of saying no. But greed does not listen to no. The first letter came politely. A development firm, on behalf of the HOA, offering to buy the acres for a fair market value. Henry folded it once and dropped it into the fireplace. The second letter came a little firmer, claiming the HOA had authority to manage underutilized parcels. That one he pinned to the wall above his desk as a reminder of the wolves at the door. By the third attempt, the language grew sharper. Failure to engage may result in municipal reclassification. It was a threat disguised as bureaucracy. And then, silence. For nearly a year, no letters, no knocks at the door. Henry thought maybe they had finally realized he wouldn't budge. Maybe they had moved on to some other vulnerable family. But greed does not sleep. It plans. One spring morning, Henry drove past the edge of his land and felt his stomach twist. Orange paint streaks marked the earth. Wooden stakes drove into the ground like intruding spears. Surveyors paced with clipboards, ignoring the no trespassing signs nailed to trees. Within weeks, machines followed. Bulldozers growled and spat dust as they flattened everything in their path. Trucks carried gravel, pouring it into the soil that Henry's grandfather had once tilled by hand. Henry stood at the fence line, watching, his fists clenched but his face calm. He could have stormed in. He could have screamed. He could have thrown himself in front of the machines. But he didn't. He knew something the HOA didn't. By midsummer, the skeleton of a subdivision was rising. Street lamps appeared where wildflowers once grew. Cement slabs hardened into driveways. Wooden frames stretched upward, forming rows of nearly identical houses. Developers smiled, homeowners toured lots, and the HOA board boasted in newsletters about their visionary expansion. To them, it was progress. To Henry, it was theft. But underneath the rage, he carried a quiet satisfaction. Because every nail they hammered, every brick they stacked, every penny they invested, was digging them deeper into his trap. The HOA held its meetings in the largest house on the block, full of smug laughter and clinking glasses. They congratulated themselves for cleaning up the land. They bragged about how much property values would climb with 120 new families paying dues. and in hushed tones they joked about how easy it had been to bulldoze one stubborn old man out of the picture. What they never realized was that the picture still belonged to Henry. When the final house was sold, when the HOA collected its first round of fees, when the pool opened with a ribbon-cutting ceremony, Henry Carter still held the deed. Untouched, unbroken, unforgiving. The subdivision stretched across his land like a parasite feeding on a host. Children played basketball in driveways built over his grandfather's soil. Neighbors planted gardens on ground where his mother had once grown beans and corn. And at night, Henry would walk to the far fence, look out at the glowing windows of the stolen homes and whisper to himself, "You don't even know what's coming." Because he wasn't just a victim, he was a strategist. His father had taught him patience. His grandfather had taught him pride. And the law, ironclad, undeniable, was on his side. The HOA thought they had erased Henry Carter, but what they had really done was gift him 120 homes. They just didn't know it yet. And soon, the trap would spring. When the first letter arrived at the HOA's office, they thought little of it. A plain envelope delivered by certified mail, with Henry Carter's name neatly signed in ink across the top. The board president, a man who had built his entire ego on golf outings and real estate bragging rights, opened it with the casual arrogance of someone who believed nothing could touch him. But as his eyes moved across the page, that arrogance faltered. The letter was not a complaint. It was not a plea. It was a notice, a precise, legally ironclad notice demanding that all activity on Henry Carter's land immediately cease. It cited deed numbers, covenant codes, notarized filings dating back decades, and at the bottom, in bold, it declared, "Any structure built, occupied, or sold on this land is the sole legal property of Henry Carter." The president read it twice, then shoved it across the table to the HOA's secretary. She skimmed it, frowned, and muttered something about paperwork errors. The treasurer suggested they forward it to their lawyer. But the uneasy silence in that room told the truth. For the first time, the HOA felt a crack in its foundation. Still, arrogance is a stubborn disease. They told themselves it was bluff. They told themselves Henry was just an angry old man trying to stir trouble. They laughed over wine that night, reassuring each other that no court in the county would dare undo an entire subdivision. But Henry wasn't bluffing. Weeks later, the summons arrived. The Carter family vs. the Evergreen Homeowners Association. Court date set, claims filed, damages listed. The homeowners panicked first. Families who had just moved in, who had put their savings, their futures, their children's bedrooms into those houses, now realized they might be living on stolen ground. They rushed to the HOA for answers, demanding reassurance. But the board offered none. Instead, they downplayed the risk, promising a quick resolution. Behind closed doors, however, panic spread like wildfire. The HOA's lawyer reviewed the covenant Henry's father had written decades earlier. He traced the signatures, the stamps, the legal codes, and finally leaned back with a grim expression. "This," he said flatly, "is airtight." The board erupted in protests. Surely there's a loophole. Surely the court won't destroy 120 families' lives. But the lawyer's face told them otherwise. Henry Carter had laid a trap so perfect that every path led straight to his victory. Court day arrived with heavy tension. The courtroom was packed. Homeowners filled the benches, whispering nervously, clutching their documents. HOA board members sat stiff in suits, sweat beading their foreheads. And at the center of it all sat Henry Carter, calm, silent. A man who had waited decades for this moment. When Henry's lawyer stood to speak, the room fell silent. He didn't shout. He didn't grandstand. He simply unfolded the original deed, yellowed with age but pristine in its authority, and placed it before the judge. "This," he said, "is the Carter family covenant. Filed, notarized, and recognized by the county registry. It states clearly that this land cannot be transferred, seized, or developed without the heir's explicit consent. That heir is my client, Henry Carter. He never gave consent. And therefore, Every single structure on this land, every house, every road, every lamppost, belongs to him. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The homeowners shifted uneasily, some clutching their heads in disbelief. The HOA board looked as though the ground had been ripped from beneath them. The HOA's lawyer rose, sputtering arguments about public interest, municipal authority, and progress. He insisted that undoing the subdivision would cause chaos, that it was unreasonable to hand 120 homes to one man. But the judge's face was unmoved. The law was not a matter of feelings. The law was the covenant. Henry's lawyer continued, methodically dismantling every excuse. He produced county records proving the HOA's petition for zoning was fraudulent. He presented evidence of forged signatures. He showed photographs of trespass markers removed, fences cut, and machines deliberately crossing boundaries. Piece by piece, he built a mountain of proof. And at the top of that mountain stood Henry Carter. The HOA's president tried to interrupt, raising his voice in desperation. But the judge silenced him with a stern warning. By the end of the hearing, the verdict was clear. The court recognized Henry Carter as the sole legal owner of the land, and therefore, the sole owner of all 120 houses built upon it. The words hit like a thunderclap. The homeowners broke into cries of outrage and fear. Some pleaded with the judge, others turned on the HOA board with fury in their eyes. The board members sat pale and silent, their empire crumbling in front of them. Henry Carter didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply sat, steady as stone, watching decades of arrogance collapse. The judge adjourned the court, but the chaos outside was immediate. News cameras swarmed the courthouse steps, capturing the faces of panicked families and defeated HOA leaders. Reporters shoved microphones forward, shouting questions about stolen land and fraudulent deals. And through it all, Henry walked calmly down the steps, his lawyer at his side, the deed in his hand. The trap had sprung. The HOA was finished. But the story wasn't over. Because now, Henry Carter owned more than land. He owned 120 homes filled with families who had no idea what would happen next. And as word spread, the entire city braced for the fallout. The news spread like wildfire. By the next morning, every local paper and news station carried the headline, "Man wins ownership of 120 homes after HOA land grab backfires." For the homeowners, it was like waking from a dream into a nightmare. Families who had unpacked boxes, decorated nurseries, and planted gardens now faced the terrifying truth. The houses they thought they owned were no longer theirs. Their mortgages suddenly meant nothing. Their deeds were worthless. They had been living on stolen land, and the rightful owner had taken it all back. At first they turned to the HOA for answers. They packed into emergency meetings, shouting at board members, demanding to know how such a catastrophe could happen. The board president tried to calm them with hollow promises. "It's temporary. We'll appeal. We'll fight this." But his words rang empty. The homeowners had seen the judge's ruling. They knew the HOA had lied. And then the anger shifted. What had once been trust and loyalty turned to fury. The same neighbors who once attended HOA picnics now shouted accusations across crowded rooms. Mothers who had spent weekends volunteering at the community pool screamed at the treasurer. Fathers who had paid their dues on time every month cursed the secretary for her smugness during the land grab. The HOA board was no longer a group of leaders. It was a circle of targets. Within weeks, lawsuits flooded in. Homeowners banded together, filing claims of fraud and negligence against the HOA. Some even demanded criminal investigations. The board members, once so proud of their control, now found themselves drowning in legal bills, public shame, and community hatred. But while the HOA crumbled, Henry Carter remained silent. For weeks after the court ruling, he stayed out of the public eye. He didn't make statements, He didn't appear on camera, and he didn't lash out at those who had wronged him. He simply let the system eat itself. Yet behind the scenes, he was preparing. Each homeowner received a certified letter, sealed with Henry's signature. Inside, a simple message. As legal owner of the property and structures, I am reviewing your tenancy. You will be contacted with terms. The letters caused panic. Some families cried, believing they were about to be evicted. Others packed boxes, bracing for the worst. But the smartest among them realized something deeper. Henry now controlled their future. The HOA board, meanwhile, faced the full weight of collapse. Their appeal was thrown out almost immediately. The court cited the Carter Covenant as unshakable. Creditors began circling, demanding repayment of loans used to fund the subdivision. The bank froze the HOA's accounts. One by one, board members resigned, fleeing from the wrath of the community. The president, once arrogant and smug, was spotted leaving town with his house up for sale, his reputation shattered. The treasurer filed for bankruptcy. The secretary, who had mocked Henry in past meetings, now received threats from the very neighbors she once lorded over. The empire of control they had built on stolen land had turned into quicksand, swallowing them whole. And still, Henry Carter said nothing publicly. Until one Saturday morning. At the center of the subdivision where the HOA once held its ribbon-cutting ceremony, Henry called for a meeting. Homeowners arrived nervously, some clutching legal papers, others holding on to a faint hope that maybe, just maybe, he would show mercy. Henry stood tall at the front, not with anger but with quiet authority. He held the deed in one hand and looked out over the crowd. For a long moment, there was silence, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the summer wind. Then, he spoke, not in fury, not in revenge, but in calm truth. He told them the history of the land, how his grandfather had fought to buy it, how his father had protected it, how his family had endured harassment, threats, and systemic injustice, and how, despite all that, they had held on. He told them of the letters he ignored, the trespasses he endured, the trap that was laid decades before any of them moved in. And finally, he told them what no one expected to hear. He did not want their families homeless. He did not want children uprooted, lives shattered, or futures destroyed. What he wanted was justice. So he gave them a choice. They could stay in their homes, every one of them, but under new terms. Henry Carter would become the landlord, the rightful owner. Rent would be paid directly to him. The HOA was dissolved permanently. No more board, no more dues, no more arrogant rules. The subdivision would exist, but it would exist on his terms. For those who could not accept it, he offered another option. Sell the house back to him outright, at a fair but reduced rate, and leave. The crowd buzzed with mixed emotions. Some wept with relief, thankful their children would not be forced onto the street. Others muttered angrily, resenting the loss of ownership. But all of them knew the truth. Henry Carter had all the power now. And for the first time in the subdivision's short history, that power rested in the hands of the man they had tried to erase. Over the next months, the neighborhood transformed. The HOA signs came down. The community pool, once restricted by endless rules, opened freely under Henry's supervision. The fences that marked violations were allowed to stand as they were. The air of control and intimidation vanished, replaced with something unfamiliar: respect. Henry did not abuse his authority. He didn't raise rents unfairly. He didn't punish or restrict. He simply ensured that the land his family had fought for was finally recognized for what it was: his. The HOA, meanwhile, ceased to exist. Its name became a punchline in news reports, a cautionary tale told across the country. Videos went viral narrating how an arrogant board had tried to steal from the wrong man and ended up handing him everything. And Henry Carter? He became a symbol, not just of victory, but of patience, strategy, and resilience. A black man who had watched generations fight for a piece of land, and who finally saw justice delivered, not through shouting, not through violence, but through the unbreakable weight of the law. The subdivision still stood, 120 homes strong. Children still played in the streets, families still gathered in backyards, but every brick, every tree, every inch of soil rested on a foundation that could never again be taken. Because Henry Carter had won. Not just the land, not just the houses, but the war his grandfather had started nearly a century before. And in the quiet of the evenings, when Henry stood at the fence line watching the lights of the houses glow, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The trap had not only sprung, it had closed forever.